$2,300 bill took the home this woman spent years paying off, and every cent was legal. A true story about a small debt, a locked door, and a government that took far more than it was owed, and about a right you may not know you have until the day one late tax check could cost you yours. For years, this one-bedroom condo had been Geraldine's whole world, the home she had paid off, where the mornings once came in through that window. In her 80s, worried about living alone, she moved to a senior community for her own safety. She never sold the condo. She kept it, empty and paid for, the way you keep a place still full of your life. The furniture stayed where she had left it. The kitchen that had held 1,000 ordinary dinners, the window that had framed 1,000 ordinary mornings, all of it waiting, the way a life waits when you are not quite ready to let it go. Her name was Geraldine Tyler, and by the time this story finds its ending, she is 94 years old. She had bought that little place in Minneapolis and made it hers one payment at a time, over years of ordinary work until the loan was gone and the deed was clean. Owning it outright was supposed to be the safe part, the one piece of a long life that no bank, no landlord, no downturn could reach. But a home you no longer sleep in still owes the city something every year, property tax. And once Geraldine moved out, the bills kept arriving at a door no one opened. Her tax had gone unpaid. Not a fortune, not a mansion's worth of back taxes, about $2,300. The price of a used car. One missed line sitting quietly in a county ledger, waiting. And this is where the machine begins to hum, because an unpaid tax bill does not simply sit and wait. It grows. The county added a penalty, then interest, then costs and fees layered on top of the costs, month after month, quarter after quarter, with no hand anywhere on the brake. So here is where it begins to tighten. By the time anyone read the figure back to her, $2,300 had swollen to roughly $15,000. The debt had multiplied more than 6 times over, not because she borrowed a single dollar more, not because she gambled or spent or ran, but because the clock kept running and the law let it run. Think about what that number really means. Not $15,000 of luxury or fraud or anything she chose. $15,000 of paperwork growing on its own against a woman in her 90s who had already paid off the very home it was now quietly consuming. She had done the hard thing, she had finished. And the finishing did not save her. This was not a loophole aimed at her alone. If your own property tax bill had ever slipped past its due date, the same process could have taken the equity you built. So sit with the question that runs under this whole story. When a system like that starts to move against one ordinary person over one small debt, is there anything left that can actually stop it? Not slow it, stop it. And by the time anyone added it up, the paperwork to sell her home was already moving. Across town, in a county office, a file with her address on it, sliding toward a sale. The county did not send a lawyer to her door. It did not have to. Because under the state's tax forfeiture law, there was no trial to win and no judge to persuade. The process ran on its own rails. Title to the condo, the ownership itself, passed out of Geraldine's hands and into the county's. And then the county did what any creditor does when it holds a property. It put the place up for sale. It sold for $40,000. Now hold that number against the debt. She owed about $15,000. The original tax, the penalties, the interest, the fees, all of it in. The sale brought in $40,000. Any bank foreclosing on any house takes what it is owed and hands the rest back to the owner. That is what makes it a debt and not a seizure. But that is not what happened here. The county kept all $40,000, every dollar of it. It took the $15,000 she actually owed, and then it kept the $25,000 that was hers. The surplus, the equity, the paid-off value of a home she had earned across a lifetime of work. And that surplus did not go into some account with her name on it, waiting to be claimed. Under the law, it was simply gone, split among the county, the town, and the school district. And there was no form she could file, no office she could call, No way to ask for a single cent of it back. The door was not just locked, there was no door. So Geraldine did the only thing left to do. She sued. She argued that taking $25,000 of her property to settle a $15,000 debt was a taking under the Fifth Amendment, the government seizing private property without paying for it, and, in effect, a fine. So far beyond the offense that it also violated the Eighth Amendment's ban on excessive fines. And notice what she was asking for, not the home. Not even a fight over the tax. She agreed she owed that. Only the change back, the difference between the small debt and the far larger value the county had pocketed. A woman near the end of her life asking for what was already plainly hers. The same overdue tax rule that had just swallowed her equity was still on the books in your state, waiting for one late check of yours until this ruling. And at first, the law did not agree with her. The federal district court dismissed her case in 2020. She appealed, and in 2122, the Federal Court of Appeals affirmed that dismissal, the same answer, one level higher up. 2 courts, 2 losses. She had asked for the difference back. The answer was a single word, nothing. And when she went to court, the court agreed, not once, but twice, which left exactly one door in the country still unopened at the top of a marble staircase, and one question hanging over it. Could 9 justices in Washington look at all this and finally call it wrong? Geraldine was not the only one. In another state, another homeowner had already carried this same fight into a federal court and won a first round the county had assumed it could not lose. The legal foundation representing Geraldine had been fighting cases like hers all across the country, in state after state, homeowner after homeowner. And one of those cases looked almost exactly like her own. The same kind of small debt, a fraction of what the home was worth, the same disappearing house, and the same government keeping everything above what it was owed. But look at what was done with that home once the county held it. It was not simply sold at auction. It was handed to a private entity for a single dollar, $1, and later resold for far more. The county and the parties that took the property kept everything above the small debt that was owed, exactly the way Minnesota had kept everything above Geraldine's. That homeowner fought it, and that case went a different way than Geraldine's had. In 2022, a federal appeals court ruled for the homeowner, holding that stripping the equity out of a home and keeping more than the debt is not a clever use of the law, but a violation of the Constitution. For the first time, a court at that level had said out loud what Geraldine had been saying all along, and losing on all along. So look at your own state on this map, because until very recently, the answer to could it happen here was yes. Because this was not a handful of unlucky cases. By one legal foundation's count, across the country in less than a decade, thousands of families had lost their homes exactly this way. Not just the taxes they owed, but everything they had built above it, adding up to hundreds of millions of dollars in equity that vanished into government accounts. And Minnesota was among the worst of it. Home after home taken over a debt that was often a thin sliver of what the property was worth. A few $1,000s owed, a whole house gone. Multiply Geraldine by 1,000 neighbors, and you start to see the size of the thing her small case was about to run into. And these were not reckless people. They were the old, the sick, the grieving, people who fell behind in a hard year and never once imagined that a small debt could cost them the largest thing they own. Every dot on that map was a kitchen, a mortgage finally paid off, a working life poured into 4 walls. And every one of them had been emptied out over a fraction of what the home was worth. But that win came from one appeals court, binding just one corner of the country. It proved she was right. It did not yet protect anyone else. Only the justices in Washington could make that rule the law everywhere. And Geraldine's case was the one climbing that far. The county walked into the Supreme Court confident. And to be fair to them, they had a reason to be. Their argument was not lawless, it was the opposite. They had followed the statute to the letter. The state legislature had written the forfeiture law, The county had simply done what the law told it to do, the way it had done for decades, the way many places across the country had done. Nobody, they said, had broken any rule. The state had passed a law. The law said the surplus stayed, case closed. And if you had ever been late on a single property tax bill, the same surplus seizure machine could have reached your house too. So the whole case sharpened to a single point. If a legislature simply writes it down, can the government keep the money left over after a debt is paid? And to answer that, Geraldine's lawyers did something the county did not expect. They stopped arguing about Minnesota and started arguing about 800 years of law. Because this idea that when the state seizes property to settle a debt, whatever is left over belongs to the owner and not to the crown, is one of the oldest promises in the entire English-speaking legal tradition. It runs straight back to Magna Carta in 1215, which provided that when the king's officers seized a debtor's goods, the residue was to be left to carry out that person's will. The surplus was never the king's to keep. Even a medieval crown had to give back what was left over. And the principle did not stop in the 13th century. By 1692, English statutes spelled it out in plain, hard words, that any overplus from such a sale had to be restored to the owner, not returned as a mercy. Not returned if you ask nicely, required by law. The rule the county was defending in the 21st century had, in fact, been the forbidden exception to a much older rule for the better part of 1,000 years. Picture the distance that promise had traveled. From barons forcing a king's hand in a meadow at Runnymede, through centuries of English courts, across an ocean, into the founding of a country that wrote property protection straight into its constitution, and then down, finally, into a routine county tax office in Minnesota, where somewhere along the way, the oldest part of the promise had simply been dropped. The county had kept the machinery. It had forgotten the limit. And it was not only ancient history. The Supreme Court's own past said the same thing. The court had recognized this surplus return principle in its own decisions, as far back as 1884 and again in 1980. So this was not some novel theory a 94-year-old had invented to save her condo. It was a rule woven through centuries of law that the county's everyday practice had quietly walked away from. Which is why, when Geraldine's lawyer, Christina Martin of the legal foundation that had carried her case, stood before the justices on April 26, 2023, the county's confident argument had a very deep problem. It rested on a single idea, that writing a rule into a modern statute could quietly erase a right this old. And 8 centuries of law were now stacked on the other side of the room. It sounded almost reasonable, until you realized the answer was written down 800 years ago on a riverbank in England. In 1215, a cornered king sealed a promise. When the crown seized a dead man's goods to settle a debt, whatever was left over had to go back to his family. The residue belonged to them, not to the king. That principle outlived him by 800 years. The rule those 9 justices were about to touch is the same rule that could have emptied the equity in your own home. Inside the courtroom, the county's lawyers made their stand. The statute was clear, title had passed, the surplus belonged to the state. And the justices pressed back, hard, with the question that undoes the whole scheme. If the government can keep $25,000 over a $15,000 debt, then what exactly stops it from keeping an entire house over a $100 one? Where is the line? Where does it end? It was the kind of question a rule cannot survive. Because the moment you admit the government has to stop somewhere between a $100 debt and a whole house, you have already admitted the surplus was never really theirs. You are no longer arguing about principle. You are only haggling over how much of someone else's money the state gets to keep. There was no good answer to that question because there was no line. And on May 25, 2023, the court gave its own answer, and it was not close. By a vote of 9-0, the Supreme Court ruled for Geraldine Tyler in an opinion written by Chief Justice John Roberts. 9 justices who agree on almost nothing agreed completely on this. And the holding was exact. The government can collect the tax you owe, it cannot keep the rest. Taking the surplus value above the debt, the court said, is a taking of private property under the Fifth Amendment, and the Constitution requires that you be paid for what is taken. The court did not even need to reach the separate excessive fines question to say that much. The taking alone decided it. But two of the justices went further. In a concurring opinion, Justice Gorsuch, joined by Justice Jackson, warned that a penalty like this one, a rule built to punish people and to deter them, is really a fine by another name, the very thing the Eighth Amendment was written to keep in check. The majority left that door for another day. But those two justices flagged it in writing for the next case that walks through it. And the case itself, the one the whole country now points to when this happens, has a fixed address in the law, 598 U.S. 631, decided in 2023. Say it plainly so no one gets it wrong. Not 600, 598. The rule of the case is simple enough to carry in one hand. The state takes what it is owed and not $1 more. Chief Justice Roberts folded the entire principle into a single line, one worth keeping in your pocket. The taxpayer, he wrote, must render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, but no more. What you owe, you owe. What is left over the government has no claim to it all. And here's the part that turns this from one woman's story into yours. By the time the court ruled, most states and the federal government already required the surplus to be returned. Geraldine's Minnesota was on the wrong side of a rule that most of the country had already accepted as basic fairness. She had not been protected by a strange law in a faraway place. She had been unprotected by an outlier in a country that mostly knew better. And in the wake of the ruling, states that had still allowed it began rewriting these laws so that the answer to, could it happen here, would finally everywhere be no. The line the court drew in Geraldine's name now runs across the whole map, including the state you are sitting in right now. 9 justices, not one dissent. The taxpayer must render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, but no more. Her home was gone. But the rule that took it was gone too. And in at least a dozen states, a warning still stands. Geraldine Tyler never moved back into that condo. The court could restore the principal, but not the 10 years or the front door or the mornings that came in through her window. What it did restore was a limit, one the country had let slip. Surplus is only one way the state can take what is yours, and it is the narrowest. Next, we follow the money that never went to court at all. You owed no one a cent, broke no law, and they still emptied your bag at the airport. Cash you earned, gone in a jetway, with no charge ever filed, and a long road to get any of it back. Subscribe and watch what a single routine flight can cost.